There's a specific kind of silence that hits a room right before somebody dies. It doesn't sound like a gasp. It sounds like a vacuum. When the drunk in the leather jacket threw his whiskey glass at the tired waitress, the diner didn't erupt. It froze. Because the man in the corner booth, the one nursing a black coffee for 2 hours, stood up. And then he walked over to the front door, flipped the sign, and turned the deadbolt. Click. It was Tuesday, and Tuesday at 2:14 a.m. smelled like burnt filter coffee and heavy-duty bleach. Alina stood behind the counter of Bell's diner, a rag in her right hand, staring at the fluorescent lights reflecting off the scratched formica. Her feet ached. It wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a dull, persistent throb that had moved from her arches up into her calves hours ago. She shifted her weight, feeling the dampness in her left shoe, where she had stepped in a puddle of melted ice back near the walk-in freezer. Outside, the city was weeping. Rain lashed against the large plate-glass windows in uneven sheets, distorting the red and yellow neon lights of the pawn shop across the street. The diner was a pocket of stale warmth in a cold, indifferent neighborhood. There were only 2 other people in the place. Old man Henderson was asleep in the third booth, a half-eaten plate of scrambled eggs cooling in front of him. Alina let him sleep. He lived in the subsidized housing down the block, and the heating in his building was broken again. Then there was the man in the corner booth. Alina didn't know his name. She knew his order. Black coffee, no sugar, and a slice of cherry pie that he rarely touched. He had been coming in every Tuesday and Thursday for the past month. He was entirely out of place. This was a diner where the vinyl seats were held together by duct tape and hope. The man in the corner wore suits that cost more than Alina's annual rent. Dark wool, silk ties pulled loose, a heavy dark overcoat draped over the back of the seat. He never looked at his phone. He never read a newspaper. He just sat there, his dark eyes taking in the street, the counter, and her. He didn't stare in a way that made her skin crawl the way the late-night truckers or the club-goers did. He watched her, the way a man watches a fire burn in a hearth. Quiet, steady, unblinking. Alina wiped the counter down for the 4th time. She dragged the damp rag over the same coffee stains, her mind blank, operating on the pure mechanical instinct of the overworked. Just 4 more hours. 4 more hours until the sun came up, until the morning cook arrived, until she could take the rattling subway back to her shoebox apartment strip off this uniform that smelled like grease and regret and sleep. The brass bell above the front door violently jingled. The door swung open, hitting the rubber stop on the wall with a loud thud. A gust of wet, freezing wind swept into the diner, rattling the napkin dispensers. Alina looked up, her customer service mask sliding onto her face out of pure reflex. "Welcome to Bell's. Sit anywhere you like." The man who walked in was a mess. He was built like a cinder block, thick and wide, wearing a cheap faux leather jacket soaked through with rain. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot, swimming in a lack of focus that screamed cheap liquor and bad decisions. He brought a smell with him. It overpowered the bleach and the coffee. It was the sharp, sour stench of sweat, stale beer, and aggressive entitlement. He didn't bother closing the door behind him. The wind continued to whip into the diner. Alina sighed, walking out from behind the counter to pull the heavy glass door shut. The click of the latch felt loud. "Hey, sweetheart," the man barked. His voice was a rasping boom. He didn't sit in a booth. He walked straight to the counter, pulling out a stool with a loud scrape of metal against linoleum, and slumped onto it. "Get me a coffee, and something fried. Don't care what." "Sure thing," Alina said, her voice flat. She didn't have the energy to be bubbly. She walked behind the counter, grabbed a thick white ceramic mug, and filled it from the pot. She set it down in front of him. "Menus are right there. Let me know when you decide on the food." The man Carl, according to the faded blue name patch stitched onto his undershirt, ignored the menu. He stared at Alina. His eyes tracked up and down her frame. Alina wore a shapeless, pale yellow uniform. It wasn't flattering, but men like Carl didn't care about the clothes. They cared about the target. "You look tired, sweetheart." Carl slurred, leaning forward, resting his heavy elbows on the counter. "Pretty girl like you shouldn't be working the graveyard. Should be somewhere warm. Someone taking care of you." Alina felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The exhaustion gave way to a spike of adrenaline. She hated this part of the job. She had a script for it. Deflect polite, but firm, keep moving. "I prefer the quiet," Alina said, turning her back to him to wipe down the espresso machine she never used. "Keeps the headache away." "Oh, come on. Don't be cold." Carl reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a dented silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and poured a generous glug of amber liquid into the steaming coffee. Alina turned around the rag, gripping tightly in her hand. "Sir, you can't do that in here." Carl paused the flask, hovering over the mug. He looked up at her, his jaw setting. "Can't do what I drink outside liquor. It's against state law and it risks our license. I'm going to have to ask you to put that away." Carl stared at her. The diner went painfully quiet. The rain drumming against the glass suddenly sounded like a roar. In the corner booth, the man in the expensive suit slowly set his coffee cup down on its saucer. There was no clink. It was a perfectly controlled movement. Carl let out a harsh, ugly laugh. He tipped the flask again, emptying the rest of it into the mug. "State law. That's funny. You the cop's sweetheart? Because you look like a glorified maid to me." Alina's jaw clenched. She reached for the mug. "I'll get you a fresh coffee, but you can't drink that here." "Don't touch my damn cup!" Carl snapped his hand, shooting out and grabbing her wrist. His grip was painfully tight. His fingers dug into the delicate bones of her arm. Alina gasped, pulling back, but he held on. His breath washed over her face, smelling of decay and alcohol. "Let go of me," Alina said, her voice trembling slightly entirely against her will. She hated the tremor. She wanted to sound strong, but she was 22 exhausted, and he outweighed her by 100 pounds. "I'm paying for a service." Carl growled, his face turning an angry mottled red. "I want to sit here. I want to drink my drink, and I want you to smile and look pretty while I do it. You understand me, you little—" "I said let go." Alina jerked her arm hard. Her sudden movement caught him off guard. His grip slipped, but in his drunken reflex to grab her again, his thick hand knocked against the heavy ceramic mug. Time didn't slow down. That was a myth. Things happened exactly as fast as they always did, leaving the brain scrambling to catch up to the physics of the disaster. The mug tipped. The dark, oily mixture of cheap whiskey and scalding diner coffee arced through the air. Alina didn't have time to flinch. The liquid hit her square in the chest. It soaked instantly through the thin, pale yellow cotton of her uniform. The heat registered a fraction of a second before the smell. It was a searing, sharp burn across her collarbone and down her ribs, hot enough to draw a sharp, involuntary gasp from her lips. She stumbled backward, bumping hard against the stainless steel prep counter. The mug hit the linoleum floor and shattered into a dozen jagged white pieces. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet diner. Alina stood frozen. She looked down at her uniform. A massive, ugly brown stain spread across her chest, the wet fabric clinging to her skin. The smell of the whiskey was nauseatingly strong, rising in the steam from the hot liquid. The physical pain was there. Her skin throbbed where the coffee had hit. But the humiliation was a heavier, colder thing. It pooled in her stomach. She felt the sudden hot prickle of tears in her eyes and violently blinked them back. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of this man. Carl sat on the stool looking at the mess. For a second, Alina thought he might apologize. Instead, a slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. "Look what you made me do," he slurred, leaning back, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "Clumsy bitch. Now you got to clean that up, too." Alina pressed her back against the cool steel of the counter. Her hands were shaking. She wiped at her chest with the damp rag, a useless, pathetic gesture that only smeared the stain further. She was so tired. The sheer injustice of the moment pressed down on her heavy and suffocating. She worked 60 hours a week. She barely slept. She smiled at people who looked right through her. And now she was standing here, burned and reeking of booze, while a drunk laughed at her. "Get out," Alina whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the hum of the refrigerators. "What was that?" Carl cupped a hand around his ear, mocking her. "Speak up, sweetheart. Can't hear you over the sound of you ruining my drink." "I said get out," Alina said louder this time. She stepped forward, her anger finally eclipsing her exhaustion. "Get out of my diner. Now." Carl's smirk vanished. The ugly, bruised redness returned to his face. He stood up. The stool screeched against the floor. He was a massive shadow blocking the fluorescent light. "You don't tell me what to do." Carl took a heavy step toward the counter. He slammed his open palm onto the formica. The crack made Old Man Henderson jump in his sleep in the third booth. "I ain't leaving until I get what I ordered. And I think you owe me an apology for spilling my damn drink." Alina stood her ground, though her knees felt like water. She reached under the counter, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the panic button installed beneath the cash register. The police response time in this neighborhood was 15 minutes on a good night. It wasn't a good night. "I'm calling the cops," Alina said, keeping her eyes locked on his. Carl laughed. It was a grating, wet sound. "Call 'em. What are they going to do? Arrest me for a spilled coffee? You knocked it over, honey. I'm the victim here." He reached out his hand, crossing the invisible boundary of the counter, aiming for her stained collar. "Now why don't you come here and—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't finish it because the atmosphere in the room fundamentally changed. The air pressure dropped. The hairs on the back of Alina's neck stood up. It wasn't a noise. It was the distinct, terrifying sensation of being watched by an apex predator. Alina looked past Carl's bulky shoulder. In the corner booth, the quiet man was no longer sitting. Christian stood up. He didn't rush. There was no frantic scramble, no shouting. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and the tailored cut of his suit emphasized the broadness of his shoulders and the lean, hard lines of his torso. He didn't look at Carl. Not yet. He smoothed the front of his jacket, a casual, elegant gesture. Then he began to walk. His leather shoes made a slow, rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the floor. He didn't walk toward the counter. He walked past it. Carl, sensing that he no longer had Alina's attention, turned around to look. "Hey, pal," Carl barked, puffing his chest out. "Mind your own business. We're having a private conversation here." Christian didn't acknowledge him. He walked straight to the front door of the diner. He reached up. His large, scarred hand grasped the cheap plastic open/closed sign hanging in the window. He flipped it. Closed. Then his hand moved to the heavy brass deadbolt. Clack! The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was the loudest thing Alina had ever heard. It echoed in the small, greasy space. It wasn't just a lock turning. It sounded like a vault ceiling shut. Christian didn't stop there. He reached up and grasped the pull cord for the dusty metal blinds covering the large plate glass window. With a smooth, steady pull, the blinds rattled down. The neon glow from the pawn shop across the street was abruptly severed. The diner was plunged entirely into the harsh, uncompromising glare of its own fluorescent lighting. They were isolated, cut off from the rain, the street, the world. Alina stopped breathing. Her hand hovered over the panic button. She suddenly realized that calling the cops wouldn't just be for her protection against Carl. Carl watched the man at the door, his drunken bravado stalling for a second, his brow furrowed in thick, slow confusion. Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing, buddy? Unlock that door!" Christian turned around. For the first time, Alina saw his eyes fully. They weren't just dark. They were dead. There was no anger in them, no outrage on her behalf. There was only a chilling, absolute vacancy. The look of a man looking at an insect on his kitchen counter before he crushes it. He walked away from the door, moving back toward the center of the room. He stopped near the third booth. Gently, almost tenderly, he tapped Old Man Henderson on the shoulder. Henderson snorted, waking up. He blinked, confused by the sudden attention. "Mr. Henderson," Christian said. His voice was a rich, low baritone, smooth like aged bourbon. It didn't belong in Bell's diner. "Go to the back room. Stay there until I tell you to come out." Henderson looked from Christian to the locked door, then to Carl. The old man had lived in the city long enough to read the weather. He didn't ask questions. He slid out of the booth as fast as his arthritic knees would allow, keeping his head down, and scuffled past the counter, disappearing through the swinging doors into the kitchen. Now there were only 3. "Are you deaf?" Carl raised his voice, though a slight tremor had entered it. The alcohol was fighting a losing battle against his primal survival instincts. He puffed out his chest, stepping away from the counter and toward Christian. "I said unlock the damn door. I'm leaving." "No," Christian said quietly. He stopped 10 feet away from Carl. "You're not." Christian reached up to the knot of his silk tie. With a casual flick of his fingers, he loosened it, unbuttoning the top button of his crisp white shirt. He wasn't preparing for a fight. He was getting comfortable. "Listen to me, you arrogant prick!" Carl sneered, taking another step forward, raising a heavy fist. "I don't know who you think you are playing hero for the waitress, but I will lay you out on this floor. Open the door." Christian finally looked directly at Carl. "You made a mess," Christian stated. It was a simple observation. "She knocked it over," Carl yelled, pointing a thick finger at Alina. "She is shaking," Christian said, his voice dropping half an octave, the temperature in the room plummeting with it. He didn't look at Alina, but she felt the weight of his awareness. "She is burned. She is humiliated. And she is shaking. In my city. On my time." Carl stopped it. The words "my city" hung in the air. The drunk thug squinted. The harsh overhead lights beat down on Christian's face, illuminating the sharp angles of his jaw, the slight pale scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the unmistakable aura of power that radiated from him like heat off a radiator. Carl was a low-level street thug. He bounced between dive bars and bad bets. He didn't run in high circles, but he lived in the gutter, and the gutter knew the names of the men who controlled the storm drains. Carl's face went entirely slack. The aggressive mottled red drained away, replaced by a sickly, pasty grey. The heavy fist he had raised slowly, uselessly fell back to his side. "Moretti," Carl breathed. The name slipped out of him like a final exhalation. Christian didn't confirm or deny it. He simply took off his tailored jacket. He folded it neatly, deliberately, and laid it across the back of the nearest clean booth. "I come here for quiet," Christian said, rolling up the cuffs of his white shirt. His forearms were corded with muscle and laced with fading ink. "I come here to drink bitter coffee and sit in peace. You have ruined the quiet." Carl took a step backward. His heel caught on a piece of the shattered ceramic mug. He stumbled, his eyes wide, darting toward the locked door, then back to the man advancing on him. "Mr. Moretti, hey, listen. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know she was yours. I was just having a bad night. Too much to drink. I'll pay for the uniform. I'll tip her $100. She isn't mine," Christian replied, his voice terrifyingly calm as he closed the distance. "She is a woman doing her job, and you threw whiskey on her." "Please," Carl begged, raising his hands now in surrender, backing up until his spine hit the edge of the counter. "I'll clean it up. I'll get on my knees and scrub the floor." "I know," Christian said. Christian stopped 2 feet in front of him. Alina stood frozen behind the counter, the damp rag forgotten in her hand. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She was terrified of Carl, yes, but the terror she felt looking at Christian was entirely different. It was the terror of watching a natural disaster unfold. You couldn't reason with an earthquake. You couldn't bargain with a hurricane. Christian slowly reached out and placed his hand on the back of Carl's thick neck. It looked like a gentle gesture. Carl whimpered. "You are going to apologize to the lady." Christian whispered, his grip suddenly tightening. The tendons in Christian's forearm stood out like steel cables. Carl choked out a gasp, his knees buckling under the sheer agonizing pressure of Christian's grip. He was forced down his heavy body, dropping onto the linoleum, right into the puddle of coffee whiskey and shattered ceramic. "I'm sorry," Carl sobbed, looking up at Alina, tears mixing with the sweat on his face. "I'm so sorry. Please." Christian looked over Carl's head, meeting Alina's eyes for the first time since the glass shattered. His dark eyes were intense, searching her face, registering the stain on her shirt, the slight reddening of her skin. "Is that apology accepted?" "Alina," Christian asked quietly. She had never told him her name. Alina swallowed hard, the sharp smell of whiskey burning her nose. She looked at the pathetic broken man on the floor, and then at the monster in the tailored shirt holding him there. She slowly nodded. "Yes." "Good," Christian said softly. He didn't let Carl go. Instead, Christian looked down at the thug. "The lady accepts your apology, but I have not." Christian's other hand pulled back. The sound wasn't like it was in the movies. There was no theatrical thwack, no dramatic groan. It sounded exactly like what it was, a heavy, dense object colliding with wet bone at a high velocity. Christian's fist connected with the side of Carl's jaw. The impact was brutally brief. Carl's head snapped to the side with a sickening crunch that echoed off the grease-stained acoustic tiles of the ceiling. The heavy, brawling momentum of the drunken man vanished instantly. His eyes rolled up, showing only the yellowed whites, and he dropped. He didn't try to catch himself. He collapsed entirely slack, dead weight, hitting the linoleum. His cheek landed in the puddle of spilled coffee and whiskey, splashing the dark liquid across the white tiles. He didn't move. He didn't twitch. The only sign he was alive was the ragged, wet wheeze escaping his slightly parted lips, blowing small bubbles in the spilled coffee. Alina shoved her hand over her mouth, biting down hard on her own knuckles to stifle the scream building in her throat. The metallic tang of blood filled the air sharply, cutting through the stench of alcohol. A thick, dark pool began to slowly ooze from Carl's nose, mixing with the brown mess on the floor. She had seen bar fights. She worked the graveyard shift. She knew what desperate men looked like when they swung at each other. This was different. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution of violence, so calculated and precise, it made her stomach heave. Christian stood over the unconscious body. He didn't look breathless. He didn't look flushed with adrenaline. He simply reached into his back pocket, retrieved a pristine, folded white linen handkerchief, and methodically wiped his right hand. He wiped the knuckles, then the spaces between his fingers, cleaning away the smear of Carl's blood. He tossed the ruined handkerchief onto Carl's chest. Christian turned to the locked front door. He unlatched the deadbolt, pushed the heavy glass open, and hooked it with his foot to keep it wide. The freezing, rain-slicked wind rushed back inside, sweeping away the stifling tension, replacing it with the bitter cold of the street. He walked back to Carl. Reaching down, Christian grabbed the collar of the man's soaked faux leather jacket. With a sharp, effortless heave, he hauled the 240-pound man off the floor. Carl's boots dragged uselessly behind him, as Christian pulled him backward toward the open door. "Hey!" Alina choked out. The word tore from her throat before she could stop it. Her brain screamed at her to shut up, to hide under the counter, and pretend she was invisible, but the sheer absurdity of the moment forced the word out. You can't just—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't know what the end of the sentence was. "You can't just leave a bleeding man on the sidewalk. You can't just kill someone in my diner." Christian paused at the threshold. He turned his head, looking back at her. The neon red glow from the pawn shop across the street caught his profile, casting his face in sharp, bloody relief. "I am taking out the trash, Alina," Christian said. It wasn't a joke. He stated it as a biological fact. "It was cluttering your floor." He stepped backward, dragging Carl out into the torrential rain. He dumped the unconscious man unceremoniously onto the wet concrete right next to the overflowing storm drain. Carl's heavy head hit the pavement with a dull thud. The freezing rain immediately began to wash the blood from his face, diluting it into pink rivulets that spiraled down into the sewer grate. Christian stepped back inside. He pulled the door shut. Clack! He threw the deadbolt again. Alina was trapped. The drunk was gone, but the monster remained. She backed up against the stainless steel prep counter, her breathing shallow and fast. Her uniform was still soaked, clinging freezing and wet against her burned chest, but she couldn't feel the pain anymore. The adrenaline had numbed her nerve endings. Christian walked toward the counter. He didn't look at the mess on the floor. He stopped directly across from her, separated only by 2 feet of scratched formica. He looked at her hands. They were trembling violently. Then his dark eyes tracked upward, resting on the massive brown stain across her collarbone. "Where is the first aid kit?" he asked. Alina couldn't speak. Her throat felt completely paralyzed. She stared at the man in the white shirt. His sleeves rolled up the faint, lingering smear of someone else's blood under his thumbnail. "Alina." His voice was low. It didn't hold the terrifying command it had held for Carl. It was steady, an anchor thrown into rough water. "The burn. Where is the kit?" She pointed a shaking finger toward the swinging doors of the kitchen. Back there, above the sink. Stay here. Do not clean the floor." Christian turned and walked into the kitchen. Alina heard his heavy rhythmic footsteps, followed by the soft murmur of his voice. He was talking to Old Man Henderson. A moment later, she heard the back door of the kitchen open and close. Henderson had been dismissed into the alleyway. They were entirely alone. Alina looked down at her hands. She forced them flat against the cold steel counter, trying to stop the tremors. She needed to think. She needed to survive. This man was Christian Moretti. She read the local news on her phone during her subway commutes. The Moretti family owned the docks, the unions, and half the politicians in the city. They weren't street gangs. They were an institution, and the man who sat in her corner booth eating cherry pie was the apex of it. She had served him bad coffee for a month. Christian returned. He carried a white plastic box with a faded red cross on the front, along with a clean, damp bar towel. He set them down on the counter. "Take off the shirt," he said. Alina stiffened her arms, immediately crossing over her chest in a defensive posture. No, I'm fine. It's just coffee. It was scalding liquid mixed with alcohol. Christian corrected her, his tone perfectly even. It is sitting against your skin. You are going to blister. Take off the uniform shirt. You have a shirt underneath. He wasn't asking, but he wasn't advancing on her either. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the counter, giving her the space to make the choice. Alina looked down. She wore a thin, long-sleeved grey thermal beneath the ugly yellow uniform. The coffee had soaked through the yellow fabric, but the thermal might have caught the worst of the heat. She was freezing, shivering uncontrollably from the shock, the wet clothes, and the sheer terror. With fumbling, uncoordinated fingers, she reached for the top button of her uniform. It took her 3 tries to undo it. She unbuttoned the front, shrugging the heavy, damp, foul-smelling yellow cotton off her shoulders. She dropped it into the plastic basin under the counter used for dirty rags. The grey thermal was stained brown at the collar, but she wasn't completely exposed. Christian opened the first aid kit. He bypassed the cheap bandages and pulled out a tube of burn ointment and a sterile gauze pad. He unscrewed the cap and squeezed a thick line of the white cream onto the gauze. He held it out to her. Alina reached for it, but her hand was shaking so badly, she knocked her knuckles against his wrist. She flinched, pulling her hand back as if she had been burned again. Christian looked at her hand, then at her face. His expression was unreadable. It was a mask carved from stone. "Your hands are compromised by adrenaline," Christian observed quietly. "You will smear it." "May I?" Alina stared at him. The man who had just nearly killed someone with a single punch was asking for permission to touch her. The absurdity of it made a hysterical, broken half-laugh escape her lips. She clamped her mouth shut, immediately horrified. "Why do you care?" she whispered. Her voice was raspy. "You make a good cup of coffee," Christian replied. "I make terrible coffee. It's burned and it tastes like metal." "You leave me alone when I drink it," he corrected himself, the ghost of a wry smirk briefly touching the corner of his mouth before vanishing. "That is a rare commodity in my life. May I?" He held the gauze up again. Alina looked at the ceiling, taking a shuddering breath. She didn't have the energy to fight him. She nodded once. Christian stepped around the counter. The diner felt instantly smaller. He took up all the oxygen in the space. He smelled of rain, expensive wool, and a faint, sharp scent of ozone, like the air right after a lightning strike. He stepped close, but didn't crowd her against the prep counter. He left exactly 6 inches of space between them. "Pull the collar down," he instructed. Alina hooked her finger into the neckline of the grey thermal and pulled it to the side, exposing her collarbone and the top of her chest. The skin was violently red, angry and hot to the touch. A blister was already beginning to form near her shoulder strap. Christian didn't hesitate, but he didn't rush. He gently pressed the gauze coated in burn cream against the angry red skin. His touch was shockingly light. His hands were massive, the knuckles scarred and rough, but his fingertips moved with a meticulous surgical care. The ointment was freezing cold. It provided an instant sharp relief to the deep, throbbing heat radiating from her flesh. Alina let out a long, shaky exhale, her eyes closing involuntarily. "Keep breathing," Christian murmured. He moved the gauze in slow, deliberate circles, spreading the thick cream over the entirety of the burn. They stood there in the fluorescent glare, surrounded by the smell of bleach, cheap whiskey, and blood, while the head of the city's criminal underbelly gently treated a minimum-wage waitress for a workplace injury. "You broke his jaw," Alina said. Her eyes were still closed. She focused entirely on the feeling of the cold cream. If she looked at him, she would panic again. "I did," Christian confirmed. His hand paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed its slow circular motion. He's going to go to the police. He will not. You don't know that. He was angry. Alina opened her eyes, looking up at him. She expected to see arrogance. She expected to see a boastful thug. Instead, Christian was looking intently at her collarbone, focused entirely on the task. Carl works as a low-level collector for a man named Russo. Russo kicks up to my brother. When Carl wakes up in that puddle, if the cold hasn't killed him, the only thing he will do is pack a bag and get on a bus out of state. He knows the consequence of making noise in a quiet room. Alina shivered. Not from the cold this time. You're a monster. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. The words slipped out, carried on the wave of her exhaustion and shock. She tensed, waiting for the anger, waiting for his hand to tighten around her throat, the way it had gripped Carl's neck. Christian didn't react. He finished spreading the cream. He folded the gauze and dropped it into the trash can beside her knee. I am a pragmatist, Alina Forsugas. Christian said, taking a step back, breaking the proximity. He wiped his hands on the damp bar towel. The world is full of vicious animals. Some wear cheap leather jackets and throw liquor at women. Some wear tailored suits and keep the animals in cages. But we are all animals. He tossed the towel onto the counter. He looked around the diner, the shattered mug, the brown puddle on the floor. Do you have a mop? He asked. Alina blinked, thrown by the sudden shift in topic. What? A mop, a bucket. Where are they? In the utility closet, by the bathrooms. Christian walked away. He disappeared down the narrow hallway. Alina heard the clatter of plastic, the sound of running water filling a bucket. A minute later, Christian Moretti walked back out into the main dining area, carrying a heavy yellow mop bucket. What are you doing? Alina asked, stepping out from behind the counter, her hands gripping her elbows. Christian didn't answer. He dropped the mop head into the hot, soapy water, wrung it out, and began to aggressively scrub the floor. He moved the shattered pieces of ceramic into a pile with the toe of his expensive leather shoe, then mopped over the stain. He worked efficiently, his broad shoulders shifting under his white shirt. He was erasing the evidence. He was cleaning her diner. Alina watched him, utterly bewildered. She felt like she had stepped into a parallel dimension. You don't have to do that. I made the mess, Christian replied, not looking up. He dragged the heavy mop in a figure-8 motion, scrubbing away the blood and the coffee. I pay for my own damages. He finished the floor in under 5 minutes. He grabbed a dustpan from behind the counter, swept up the ceramic shards, and dumped them into the trash. He carried the mop bucket back to the utility closet. When he returned, he walked over to the booth where he had left his suit jacket. He picked it up, slipping it over his broad shoulders, adjusting the lapels. The brief window of domestic normalcy, if mopping up blood could be considered normal, snapped shut. He was the boss again. The armor was back on. He walked to the counter. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick silver money clip. He peeled off 3 crisp $100 bills and laid them flat on the clean, dry section of the formica. For the uniform and the broken cup, Christian said. A cup costs $3, Alina said, staring at the money. It was more than she made in 3 brutal shifts. Consider the rest a deposit, Christian said. Alina looked up at him, her brow furrowing. A deposit for what? Christian walked to the front door. He unlocked the deadbolt. He reached up and flipped the plastic sign back to open. He didn't pull the blinds up. He paused with his hand on the brass handle. He looked back at her. The harsh overhead lights cast deep shadows under his eyes. He looked tired. It was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that Alina recognized instantly. It was the look of someone who carried weight they could never put down. I like the quiet in this place. Alina, Christian said softly. The rain lashed against the door, eager to get back inside. I will be back on Thursday. I expect my coffee to be hot. I expect my pie to be cherry. And I expect you to be unbothered. He didn't wait for a reply. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the freezing, relentless storm. The door swung shut behind him. Clack. The latch caught. The diner was empty again. Alina stood alone behind the counter. The smell of bleach and burnt filter coffee slowly began to overtake the metallic tang of violence. The diner was perfectly quiet. She looked at the $300 sitting on the counter. She reached out her fingers, brushing the crisp paper. Her chest throbbed a dull ache beneath the cool burn cream. Thursday. She had 48 hours to figure out how to serve coffee to a monster who knew her name. The blister popped on Wednesday morning. It wept clear fluid into the cheap gauze Alina had taped to her chest, stinging with a sharp, insistent bite every time she moved her left arm. She spent the $300 Christian had left on the counter. She paid her overdue gas bill, bought 2 tubes of medical-grade burn ointment, and purchased 3 new stiff yellow uniform shirts from the supply store downtown. She didn't keep a dime for herself. Keeping the money felt like signing a contract she hadn't read. Thursday night arrived with a suffocating dry cold. The rain had passed, leaving behind black ice and a biting wind that rattled the diner's large glass windows. Alina stood behind the counter, staring at the green digital clock on the microwave. It was 1:58 a.m. The diner was empty. Old man Henderson had caught a cold and stayed in his apartment. The usual smattering of insomniacs and third-shift cabbies seemed to have collectively decided to avoid Bells tonight. Alina knew why. Neighborhoods like this had a nervous system. Word traveled fast. A man had been dragged out of Bell's diner by his collar and left bleeding on the grate. You didn't walk into a room where the floor had just been mopped for blood. At 2 a.m. exactly, the brass bell above the door jingled. Alina's stomach plummeted, a cold, heavy stone dropping into her pelvis. Christian Moretti walked in. He wore a dark charcoal overcoat, unbuttoned over a black suit. The cold air rushed in with him, but he didn't seem to feel it. He closed the door quietly. He didn't look at her immediately. He walked to the coat rack near the entrance, draped his heavy coat over a wooden peg, and then moved to his usual booth in the back corner. He sat down. He folded his hands on the cracked formica table. Then he looked at her. Alina's throat was bone dry. She wiped her hands on her apron, ignoring the sharp pull of the burn against her new stiff collar. She grabbed a clean ceramic mug. They had a whole stack of them, but her brain noted absurdly that this one wasn't chipped, and walked over to the coffee maker. She poured the black, bitter liquid. She walked to the pie case, plated a slice of cherry pie, and set both on a small tray. Her hands were steady. She willed them to be steady. She walked out from behind the counter and approached his booth. "Good evening," Christian said. His voice was that same low, rumbling baritone. It sounded entirely normal. It sounded like a man who hadn't shattered a human jaw in this exact room 48 hours ago. "Evening," Alina managed. She set the coffee down first, then the pie. She didn't spill a drop. She took a step back, ready to retreat to the safety of the prep counter. "Sit," Christian said. It wasn't a request, it wasn't a threat either. It was a simple, flat directive. Alina froze. "I have to work. The diner is empty, Alina, and you are exhausted. Sit down." He didn't gesture to the seat across from him. He just looked at her, his dark eyes stripping away the cheap uniform, the defensive posture, the customer service mask she tried to wear. He saw the dark, bruised bags under her eyes. He saw the slight stiffness in her left shoulder. Slowly, Alina slid into the vinyl booth opposite him. The seat squeaked underneath her. She kept her hands in her lap, her fingers twisting the fabric of her apron. Christian didn't touch his coffee. He looked at the collar of her new shirt. The burn. "It's fine," Alina said quickly. Too quickly. "It blistered. I bought the good ointment. It's healing." "Did you go to a clinic?" "I don't have insurance for a clinic," Alina replied, a flare of defensive pride cutting through her anxiety. "And I don't need a doctor to tell me to put cream on a burn. I'm fine." Christian accepted the mild defiance without blinking. "And the man? Has he been back?" "Carl?" Alina shook her head. "No, I haven't seen him. I don't think anyone has. He is currently in a motel in Cleveland. He found religion and a bus ticket very quickly," Christian said dryly. He finally reached for his mug. He took a slow sip of the scalding, terrible coffee. He didn't grimace. Alina stared at him. "You tracked him. I ensure loose ends do not unravel in my direction. Or yours." Christian set the cup down. "You bought new shirts. You left $300. The shirts cost $40. Alina reached into the deep pocket of her apron. She pulled out a neatly folded stack of bills, 200s and 320s. She slid them across the table toward him. "Here is the change. Thank you for the uniform. You didn't owe me that." Christian looked at the money. He didn't reach for it. "I told you to consider it a deposit." "I don't take deposits," Alina said, her voice growing firmer. She leaned forward slightly, ignoring the pull of her burned skin. "Look, I know who you are, Mr. Moretti." Christian's jaw tightened infinitesimally at the name. "Christian?" "I know who you are," Alina repeated, ignoring the correction. "And I appreciate that you stepped in on Tuesday. I really do. But I can't owe a man like you. I work a diner. I take the subway. I pay my rent late. I live in a very small, very predictable world. I want to keep it that way. Take the money." Christian watched her. He saw the genuine fear, but he also saw the iron spine underneath it. She was terrified of him, but she was pushing his money back across the table anyway. Slowly, Christian reached out. He placed his large, scarred hand flat over the folded bills. He dragged the money back across the table, picking it up and sliding it into his suit pocket. "Fine," Christian said. "No debts, no deposits." Alina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her shoulders slumped a fraction of an inch. "Thank you." However, Christian continued his voice, dropping a register anchoring her to the spot. "You misunderstand the reality of your small, predictable world, Alina. It is only predictable because the animals outside this glass have decided not to break it yet." He leaned forward. The scent of ozone and expensive wool washed over her again. "I come here because it is quiet," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "You do not ask me questions. You do not try to impress me. You just pour the coffee. That is a sanctuary for a man who lives in a very loud, very violent world. I will not allow that sanctuary to be polluted by street trash. So you do not owe me anything. But understand this, while I am sitting in this booth, nothing in this city can touch you." He leaned back, breaking the intense proximity. He picked up his fork and cut a small piece of the cherry pie. "Go back to work, Alina. I am fine here." Alina stood up. Her legs felt slightly numb. She walked back behind the counter, her mind racing, the echo of his words ringing in her ears. Sanctuary. The boss of the city's underbelly viewed her grease-stained, fluorescent-lit diner as a sanctuary, and he had just quietly, unilaterally declared her under his protection. She didn't know whether to feel incredibly safe or entirely doomed. 3 weeks passed. The blister healed into a tight, shiny pink scar hidden beneath Alina's collar. The diner changed. It wasn't anything you could see. It was an absence. The local drunks who used to stumble in at 3 a.m. to sleep off their benders stopped coming. The aggressive teenagers who used to occupy a booth for 4 hours and tip in loose pennies vanished. Even the police cruisers, which usually parked half a block away to avoid dealing with the diner's usual nonsense, started doing slow, deliberate laps past the front window every hour. An invisible ironclad perimeter had been drawn around Bell's diner. Christian never missed a Tuesday or a Thursday. He always arrived at 2 a.m. He always drank the coffee. He always ordered the pie. They rarely spoke more than a few sentences, but the silence between them mutated. It was no longer the heavy, nervous silence of a waitress and a mob boss. It became a shared, breathing thing. A comfortable quiet. Alina found herself anticipating the sharp chime of the doorbell. She found herself making a fresh pot of coffee at 1:50 a.m., so it wouldn't taste burnt when he arrived. She hated herself for it, but the crushing loneliness of the graveyard shift had cracked, and Christian Moretti was the wedge holding it open. On a Tuesday in late November, the perimeter was tested. It was 1:15 a.m. Christian wasn't due for 45 minutes. The door banged open. 2 men walked in. They weren't street trash like Carl. They wore suits, but the suits fit poorly. Their ties were garish. They had the thick, restless energy of men who were used to breaking things to get paid. The lead man, a guy with slicked-back hair and a nose that had been broken and reset badly, walked straight to the counter. He slammed his hand flat on the formica. "Hey, where is he?" the man demanded. Alina stepped back, her hand instinctively drifting toward the panic button beneath the register. "Where is who?" "Don't play stupid, sweetheart," the man sneered. He leaned over the counter, invading her space. He smelled of cheap cologne and stale cigarette smoke. "Moretti. My boss needs to see him, and word is he's slumming it in this dump every Tuesday." "Where is he?" Alina's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She kept her face blank. "I don't know who you're talking about. I just serve coffee. If you want a booth, take one. If not, the door is right behind you." The man laughed a harsh, ugly sound. He looked back at his partner, who was standing by the door with his arms crossed. "She's got a mouth on her. Look, honey, I don't have time to play games with the help. Tell me when he gets here, or I'm going to start smashing your pie cases until your memory improves." He reached out his hand, wrapping around the heavy glass sugar dispenser on the counter. He lifted it, preparing to hurl it into the glass pastry display. The diner door opened. There was no violent slam, no rush of wind, just the quiet chime of the brass bell. Christian stepped inside. He was early. The man holding the sugar dispenser froze. He turned around. The sneer wiped entirely off his face, replaced by a sudden, sickening pallor. Christian stood near the entrance. He didn't take off his coat. He looked at the man by the door, then at the man by the counter, holding the glass dispenser. "Frankie," Christian said. His voice was a soft, lethal whisper that carried across the diner with perfect clarity. Frankie hastily set the sugar dispenser back down on the counter. His hands were suddenly trembling. "Mr. Moretti, we were just looking for you. Sal needs to talk. It's urgent." Christian began to walk forward. The slow, methodical tap of his shoes on the linoleum sounded like a countdown. "Sal needs to talk." Christian repeated his tone, conversational, but devoid of any human warmth. "So Sal sends his loudest, stupidest dog into a place I eat to shout at a woman I know." Frankie swallowed hard. He backed away from the counter. "I didn't mean no disrespect, boss. She wasn't giving me answers." Christian stopped 3 feet away from Frankie. The height difference was only a few inches, but Christian seemed to tower over the man. The air in the diner turned dense, heavy with the promise of violence. It was exactly like the night with Carl, but sharper, more terrifyingly controlled. "Her name is Alina," Christian said. Frankie blinked, confused. "What? Her name is Alina," Christian repeated, his voice dropping another octave. "She is not sweetheart. She is not honey. She is not the help. She is the woman who runs this room, and you are threatening to break her property. I'm sorry. I didn't know she was with you." Christian didn't hit him. He didn't even raise his hand. He simply leaned in his face, inches from Frankie's sweating forehead. "If you ever raise your voice in this building again," Christian whispered the words, dripping with absolute certainty, "I will not hit you. I will not kill you. I will put you in a shipping container, down at the port, lock it from the outside, and let you starve to death in the dark. Do you understand me?" Frankie's breath hitched. He nodded frantically, his eyes wide with stark terror. Yes, Mr. Moretti. I understand. Get out. Tell Sal I will see him tomorrow at noon." Frankie didn't hesitate. He practically ran for the door, his partner already holding it open. They scrambled out into the night, the door swinging shut behind them. The diner was quiet again. Christian exhaled slowly. The terrifying, murderous aura dissolved, leaving behind only the weary man in the tailored suit. He walked to the counter. He didn't sit in his booth. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope. He set it on the counter, sliding it across the formica until it stopped directly in front of Alina. Alina looked at the envelope. Her pulse was still racing. She hadn't hit the panic button. She hadn't even thought about the police. She had only looked at Christian. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "It is a cell phone," Christian said quietly. "It has one number programmed into it. Mine." Alina stared at the white paper. "I don't need this. You just scared them off. Frankie is a symptom. The city is shifting. There will be noise soon." Christian looked at her, his dark eyes heavy. "I cannot always be here at 2 a.m., Alina. If someone comes through that door and they do not care about the rules, you press call. You don't have to speak. Just press call and drop the phone. I will be here in 4 minutes." He turned to leave. "Christian." He stopped. It was the first time she had used his first name without him prompting her. He turned back. Alina reached out and picked up the envelope. It was heavy. It felt like a tether. "Why?" she asked, her voice raw. "I'm just a waitress. Why are you dragging me into your world?" Christian walked slowly back to the counter. He stood right in front of her. The physical barrier of the formica felt entirely useless. "I am not dragging you into my world, Alina," he said softly, his voice rough. "I am trying to keep my world from bleeding into yours." It already did. She counted, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the envelope. "Carl bled on my floor. Frankie just threatened to smash my counter because of you. Your presence here is what makes it dangerous. You think this city is safe without me?" Christian let out a bitter, humorless breath. "Before I sat in that booth, this place was a hunting ground for every drunken junkie with $5 and a bad temper. You were entirely unprotected. I watched you flinch every time the door opened. I watched you grip that rag like a weapon." Alina's breath hitched. He had seen everything. All the fear she thought she hid so well. "I handled it," she said fiercely, her chin lifting. "I survived. You shouldn't have to just survive," Christian said. He reached across the counter. He didn't grab her wrist. He didn't force her. He gently placed his hand over hers, enveloping her trembling fingers, the white envelope trapped between their palms. His hand was warm, calloused, and heavy. It was the most grounded she had felt in years. "My life is calculated violence. Christian said, his eyes locking onto hers, stripping away the final layers of pretense. Every conversation is a negotiation. Every room I walk into is a tactical assessment. I do not trust the people who smile at me, and I kill the people who don't. That is my reality. He stepped closer to the counter. But when I walk in here, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, it stops. For 2 hours a week, the noise stops. You hand me a terrible cup of coffee, and you treat me like a normal, exhausted man. You are the only quiet thing in my life, Alina. Alina stared up at him. Her chest tightened, an uncomfortable, terrifying warmth blooming behind her ribs. She was looking at a ruthless criminal. She was looking at a killer. But right now his eyes were stripped bare, showing a profound, desperate exhaustion. He wasn't asking for her body. He wasn't asking for her submission. He was asking for a place to breathe. If I keep this phone, Alina whispered, looking down at their hands. If I accept this, I'm not just the waitress anymore. I'm yours. That's how your people will see it. They will see you as untouchable, Christian corrected firmly. And how will you see me? She asked, looking back up, meeting his gaze head-on. She needed to know. Christian didn't answer immediately. He looked at her face, the stubborn set of her jaw, the dark circles under her eyes, the sheer unyielding resilience that kept her standing behind this greasy counter, night after night. I will see you, Christian said slowly, his thumb gently brushing across her knuckles, as the only thing I have left to protect that actually matters. A heavy silence descended on the diner. It wasn't tense, it was definitive. A line had been crossed, and the bridge behind them was burning. Alina knew she should slide her hand out from under his. She should push the envelope back. She should tell him to leave and never come back. But the diner was cold and his hand was warm. Slowly, deliberately, Alina turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. She gripped his hand tightly. Okay, she breathed. The word was a surrender and an acceptance all at once. Okay. Christian let out a slow, ragged exhale, as if a massive weight had just been lifted from his shoulders. He squeezed her hand, a firm, grounding pressure. He let go. He picked up the cold cup of coffee he hadn't finished. He took a sip, grimaced slightly at the temperature, and set it down. I have business to attend to, Christian said, his posture straightening, the armor sliding back into place, though the harsh edges were softened when he looked at her. Keep the phone charged. Keep it in your pocket. I will, Alina said. She slid the envelope into the deep pocket of her yellow apron. Christian turned and walked to the front door. He grabbed the handle, but he didn't pull it open. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the dark, empty street through the glass. The city was out there. The noise, the blood, the chaos. He didn't open the door. Instead, Christian reached up and grasped the small plastic sign in the window. He flipped it. Closed. Then his hand moved to the heavy brass deadbolt. Clack. The lock slid home. Christian turned around. He didn't walk back to his booth in the corner. He walked back to the counter, pulled off his dark overcoat, and laid it across one of the stools. He loosened his silk tie. He sat down at the counter, right in front of her. Pour me a fresh cup, Alina, Christian said softly, a ghost of a real smile touching his lips. I think I'll stay until the sun comes up. Alina smiled back, a genuine, tired, completely real smile. She picked up the glass pot, the bitter smell of the coffee filling the space between them, and poured. The world outside the locked door could burn. In here, it was quiet. Wow, what an intense ending. Thank you guys so much for sticking with this story all the way through. If you loved the tension and that final quiet moment between Alina and Christian, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Do you think Alina made the right choice? Keeping the phone. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love dark mafia, romance, and subscribe for more deeply emotional, dramatic stories every single week. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. See you in the next one.